Having talked a little bit about the United Nations Security Council and the United Nations system more generally in terms of international peace and security, I think it's worth drilling into the role of peacekeeping in the international system and kind of talk a little bit about how the philosophy and approach to peacekeeping has changed over the years. And so when we're thinking about peacekeeping operations, many, not all peacekeeping operations are carried out by the UN Security Council or through the UN system. This is sort of a geographic picture of sort of where we have seen peacekeeping operations over the years. You can also get peacekeeping operations that are carried out by regional organizations, sometimes on their own. So NATO's operation in Kosovo versus African Union operations or ECOWAS operations in Africa. Sometimes those are carried out in conjunction with the UN, so the UN will authorize the mission to be carried out by a regional organization. You can also see peacekeeping operations that are carried out by individual states, although that's perhaps a little bit less common. When we think about peacekeeping, there's been a real shift. Throughout much of the Cold War, peacekeeping followed a pattern of what we could call maybe old peacekeeping, which was basically all you could get through the United Nations Security Council, given the deadlock between the United States and the Soviet Union. So with old peacekeeping, basically the idea of peacekeepers was that they would simply monitor the implementation of a peace treaty. They're not there to play any particular role in the peace process to favor one side or another. They're literally just there to observe. So peacekeeping operations were oftentimes small. They were sent in after there had already been a peace agreement arrived at, armies had withdrawn, and this small force, they're unarmed, they're maybe equipped with a radio, binoculars, a jeep, and they just drive up and down the border, a couple times a day, checking, is the country on that side of the border massing forces? Is the country on the other side of the border massing forces? If the answer is no, then they go back and they play checkers or Mario Kart or whatever peacekeepers do when they're not actively out there observing that war hasn't broken out. And the purpose for this was so that if war did break out, they could report back to New York, to the Washington, or to the UN Security Council, and explain who they observed as the aggressor, to provide information on that. So it's really just a very observational kind of role. In recent decades, since the end of the Cold War, peacekeeping has taken on a much more robust kind of or set of activities, which we sometimes describe as new peacekeeping, in which peacekeepers are now playing an active role in trying to make peace actually stick and hold together, possibly contributing to disarmament, and in some cases actually forcing peace or forcing confronting violations of peace. And so these peacekeeping forces oftentimes are much larger. So an old style peacekeeping force could literally be 15 or 20 people, whereas I think the largest UN peacekeeping operation is based in the Democratic Republic of Congo and has 40,000 plus UN blue helmets, soldiers in uniform who are armed and who are able to conduct offensive military operations, right? So that's another difference, right? They're not there to just observe. They can take part in hostilities. They oftentimes have restricted rules of engagement about when they can do that, but they have that potential, and they have the coercive power that they can use and can request additional authority as the conflict changes and evolves, so that they could have the rules of engagement that allowed for them to play an even more direct role. And so, and they're doing a whole host of different things. We'll talk about that a little bit in a second here. That shift between old style peacekeeping and new style peacekeeping really got crystallized in a document put out by the United Nations Secretariat under Boutros Boutros-Ghali in his 1992 report, An Agenda for Peace, in which he essentially argues to the United Nations and the United Nations Security Council that now that the Cold War is over, the United Nations can do a lot more than it was ever able to do during the Cold War because of the deadlock between the United States and the Soviet Union. And so he sort of sketches out what are the different ways that peacekeeping forces could be used. And so he denotes sort of what we might call traditional peacekeeping, or the old style of peacekeeping, in which you have a small force that's job is just to observe and report. But he says we could also do peace enforcement, right, where we're taking direct action to confront breaches of the peace, and to support a peace agreement and to help to make it stick. So peacekeeping forces could be involved in disarmament and demobilization of militias or of combat units. They could be providing security and checkpoints. They could be providing security through policing, right? They could be actively on the ground providing a security apparatus for a state that allows for the conflict to kind of disentangle itself following what could be a very weak ceasefire. And then he says we could also do peacemaking, and that could be everything from inserting a large UN peacekeeping force on the ground in an active conflict to try to force the various parties to the table, or it could be trying to protect civilians, or to keep humanitarian corridors open, right? There's active ways that the UN could play a role in conflict settings in a way that would never have gotten through the Security Council during the Cold War, when it would either have been viewed as favorable or unfavorable to the United States or the Soviet Union, and either state would have probably vetoed any sort of active role for the international community that they might have perceived as harmful to their interests. And so we still see old-style peacekeeping, but you'll get missions that have many more of these elements of either peace enforcement or of peacemaking as part of more contemporary, more recently authorized peacekeeping missions. I want to sort of talk through some of the good and the bad of UN peacekeeping missions. And so I'll start with the good, and then I don't have bullet points on this because it kind of rattles off the top of my head. Prior to Boutros Boutros-Ghali putting out the Agenda for Peace, when we look at civil wars and how civil wars ended, there were virtually no civil wars that ended in negotiated agreement. After an Agenda for Peace, almost half of all civil wars end in negotiated agreement. And the factor that changed that was the availability of peacekeeping, that made a negotiated settlement possible in a large number of conflicts in ways that just wouldn't have been possible without international support through peacekeeping. So when political scientists look at the effectiveness of peacekeeping, empirically, just looking at the numbers and what it shows, we see that this has been a incredible, transformative force in terms of how conflicts get resolved and managed in the international system. And we would typically argue that it's been a good thing because shortening conflicts and reducing the loss of life are generally viewed as good things. That having been said, when we look at the sort of moral perspective on peacekeeping and some of the actual practice of peacekeeping, there is, I think, a lot to critique in peacekeeping operations. And so one of the things that's worth differentiating here from when we talked about collective security is that collective security is a system that's aimed at confronting aggressors. Peacekeeping that has operated traditionally and even under new peacekeeping really sidesteps that question about who's at fault, who is the aggressor. It simply seeks to stop the fighting, to freeze events on the ground, and it may inadvertently freeze events on the ground in unstable ways. And so during the Bosnian conflict, the peacekeepers were inserted into territory that Serb forces were actively seeking to ethnically cleanse, to drive out Bosnians, and that put UN forces kind of in an impossible situation of being behind enemy lines, being forced to protect civilian populations when they functionally didn't have the military resources to do it, and resulted in UN peacekeeping forces essentially sidestepping some of their stated responsibility in Srebrenica, where Serb militias rolled through and rounded up young Bosnian men who were presumably massacred. Folks have argued that when you're facing situations like that where there is a clear aggressor, or even when you're just facing a conflict that you want ended, seeking to force a negotiated settlement or seeking to freeze events on the ground just may actually be counterproductive, and it may actually be better to let things resolve themselves quickly and maybe even pick a side and help the conflict end quickly. There is some empirical evidence for this. One of the things that we find is that while when peacekeeping is put in place before a final peace agreement is reached, it oftentimes takes forever, a much longer time to reach that final peace agreement. The conflict essentially gets frozen in sort of a stalemated ceasefire without the underlying issues being resolved, which is frustrating. The other critique of peacekeeping that is worth talking through is that UN peacekeepers are not a professional army. The UN does not maintain a standing army. It cannot finance a standing army. The United Nations puts out a call to other countries to fill peacekeeping operations, to essentially donate or offer up their own soldiers to participate in these missions. And those missions are staffed with people who may have limited military capabilities. And in fact, the missions may have limited political capabilities as well. I'll flag the UN operation in Rwanda before the genocide. It was essentially an old-style peacekeeping operation. It was there to observe the implementation of the Arusha Accords, but when the Hutu-led government started a genocide against the Tutsis in Rwanda, the head of the UN peacekeeping mission in Rwanda called back to New York to the Security Council and begged for the authority to expand the mission, to make it a peace enforcement or a peacemaking mission, to provide for a humanitarian role, begged for increased military capacity to be able to actually stop the genocide, and was told no, was told that was not going to happen, that was not going to be the role of this peacekeeping mission, was told to evacuate, that he had essentially done his job and his force had done its job under old-style peacekeeping, which was to observe what's happening, to report on what's happening, and then to get out and leave that to a political decision about how it will be handled, which all in all seems quite dissatisfying, considering about 700,000 people ended up dying over the course of about 100 days in that genocide. The other challenge, concern, problem with peacekeeping operations is that there's been a number of instances over the decades of peacekeeping forces behaving not just in an unprofessional manner, but in a manner that borders on war crimes. And so there have been just horrific cases of abuses in Haiti and in the Democratic Republic of Congo, suggesting that maybe the oversight or the accountability over UN missions isn't what we would hope it would be. And these are all concerns and challenges that come with any military system of providing oversight and command and control. But I think get put into greater under a spotlight because UN peacekeeping missions are supposed to have a humanitarian agenda and mission, and the legitimacy of the United Nations is oftentimes tied to how peacekeepers perform in their actions.